請勿靠近車門。
請不要靠近車門。
Please stand back from the doors.
All right, welcome to What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. I am your host. My name is Kyle. And for all the listeners that are brand new to the show, this is a show where I interview diaspora Asians about their life stories and experiences. They are really cool people that I think you will find interesting and inspirational, and you will learn a lot of cool things about what they do and what they're all about. And if you want to support this podcast, it's really easy. Just keep listening and also follow the podcast on your streaming platforms. Check us out on YouTube and also follow the Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. And if you really like the podcast, make sure to share with your friends and family. Having the word out on this podcast to all your friends and family will definitely help this podcast grow and allow me to continue to bring in more interesting guests along the way. And with this podcast, I've been very fortunate to be able to talk to a lot of cool diaspora Asians about their life and stories. And for this week's guest, she's also the same, very interesting. And I'm very happy that I found her, or at least got into like knowing about her and her content and her story through a past guest of ours, Brittany from Cantonese with Brittany. I believe that's how I kind of interacted with this upcoming guest. It was just that Brittany shared her content on her page, and then I saw it and I started following her as well because I think what she's doing is great. And without further ado, let's bring her in and let her introduce herself and let us know all about her stories and experiences. So today I have Jeannette from Down Under. Hi, Jeannette. How are you doing today?
Hi, Kyle. I'm well, thank you. And how are you?
I'm doing great. Very excited to have you because I've been hoping to have you come on, but I was always afraid, like, will she respond? Will she say yes? All that stuff. You are doing really good things. You've been doing it for quite a while now, it seems, and you have attracted a large following and all that stuff, doing really great things. So again, very happy to have you, very appreciative for your time. And with all my guests, I like to try to kind of know them a little better at the beginning and see how they respond to this great question that at least I think is a great question is, what kind of Asian are you?
Oh, that's a very good question. So my name is Jeannette, and I was born and raised in Australia. I was actually born and raised in a place called Sydney. My background is a mixture of Australian, a bit of Chinese, a bit of Vietnamese as well. And for those of you, all the people who have been following my content, you'll see that, I have a lot of Chinese and Vietnamese food that I share. In terms of my parents, they were born in Vietnam, but both of them identify as Chinese. My dad's Cantonese, and that's what I speak at home with my parents and with my grandma. And my mum's Chao. And my grandma, she's actually Vietnamese. And I only very recently learned about this in like the past few years, that she's fully Vietnamese. I thought she was Chinese, but it turns out that it's because she married my grandfather that she ended up learning Chinese and learning how to cook Cantonese food. So that was very interesting.
Wow, that's an interesting kind of family background and kind of like family history that I think a lot of Asians, at least East Asians, I find like, they don't really have that much in-depth kind of understanding, because I think a lot of times we just assume we are what we are. We don't have to really check those, popular DNA testing. We know we're Chinese or we know we're Korean for sure. And then sometimes you might find a surprise here and there's like, my family background might not be 100% of what I expected from early on. Like with your grandma, where you think she was Chinese all along, but she isn't. So that's really interesting.
And I think sometimes it comes out of like these conversations that you have with your family, which is very important. It's important to talk to your family about your history and where kind of everything fits and where everyone came from. So I think that's how I found out. I found it very late in my life, but that's something that I won't forget. And I do appreciate it as well.
Yeah, for sure. And during your intro, you kind of alluded that, you do content. You do that. Can you just further elaborate what exactly that you do in terms of content creating?
Yeah, sure. So with content, it started off as just a way for me to connect with my grandma. I only wanted to document all of my grandma's food because I loved my grandma's food. Everything she makes, and ever since I was little, I've always believed that my grandma cooks really well, and I've had people tell me that as well. So I wanted to make sure that I suppose, honored her recipes by documenting them. And it started off with me following my grandma around the shop. I would go to university, but then on my days off, especially when there were long periods where I had time off, I would take her to the shops. I would drive her down, and I'd follow her along. I'd literally shadow her with my phone in my pocket. And every time she would buy something, I would ask her, why are you choosing this? Why are you choosing that instead? How do you choose this pumpkin over this pumpkin? And she would tell me all these little tips and tricks. But also, she would take the time to check out every single grocery store. And then she'd come back and say, I actually want to get the pineapple from here because it's much better and much fresher here. So I learned so much from her, and it happened every day, as much as I could, really. And I would tick off all the recipes that I remember from my childhood, and I would learn as much as I could. I think by now I should have most, if not all, of the recipes that I remember written down anyway. And, from that, I wanted to make sure that they were documented. And it started off just being documented in a book. But then through time, I thought, I have friends who are, roughly my age, and we're getting to a point in our lives where people are starting to think about having families. And while we're all very fortunate that our friends, we have our parents, for some of us, we also have our grandparents around, there'll be a day, sadly, when, that may not be the case. And so I wanted to make sure that I shared recipes that people could really connect to. And these recipes hopefully would remind them of their family, of their homes, of their own childhood, of their own upbringing. And hopefully they can share that with their own families, their own children, as they have their own. And so really that's my goal. And that's why I started it.
So you're a content creator focused on recipes that you have learned from your grandma and your family, which I think is really cool because you started off where it's like you just want to make sure you have all these recipes so that in case you no longer have your family with you as you age and stuff, you still have those recipes that you could look back and cook yourself, which I think is really important. And it seems like a lot of other people, or one person that I think of that I've interviewed in the past, Randy from Maybe Lao, is also thinking in that same wavelength of like preserving the recipes of his family and all that stuff, which I think is really cool because I think a lot of you that does this or do this, you intended it just for yourself, but now what you're doing can actually affect so many people that are looking for these kind of content to satisfy their kind of desire to connect with their food or like reconnect with their family kind of roots and stuff, which I think is really great. And we'll get back to your content for sure in a bit, but I really want to talk about like your experience before like you become like this great content creator focused on like recipes and such, because I think there should be like a linear kind of path that led you to this. And I'm sure it wasn't what your intentions were at the beginning. For sure, you didn't make it out like, I want to be like this, right? So how was your childhood like growing up in Australia and all that? And like, what did you start thinking of a job? What was it that you wanted to do?
Well, when I was little, I actually didn't know what I wanted to do for the longest time. And then, you go to school and you kind of toss and turn with a few other ideas. Wanted to be an author at one point. And then eventually it wasn't until I was actually even wanted to be a psychologist at one point towards like my later schooling life. But it wasn't until I was in years 11 and 12 for the final 2 years of high school, just before I would choose my university degree. That was when I decided to become a teacher. And the reason why I decided was because I had some fantastic teachers, some really inspirational, caring teachers in my last 2 years of school that inspired me and who inspired me to become a teacher myself. So my day job is actually, I do teach little kids, and it's great. And in terms of how this all started to become like food content creation, obviously it didn't start from that, but I think at home I have a lot of influence with food. Like my grandpa, back when he was alive, So this was 13 years ago. He always made sure that we sat around the dinner table. So at 6 and 7 o'clock, like roughly within that hour, everybody would be gathered around the table, and we would all be sitting there and eating dinner. And I think that was the start of that connection between food and family for me. And maybe for a lot of other people, that's the same as well. And then, obviously my grandma cooks a lot and she makes really good food. So that also, drives that whole idea of, creating food content. And then my dad has a lot of experience in the hospitality field or in that domain. My dad's been, he's been a waiter. He's been a sous chef. He's been a chef to some degree. He's been a manager, an owner of a restaurant. So he knows a lot of techniques, especially when it comes to Cantonese cooking. Not necessarily because he's cooked himself, but because he's had a lot of conversations with head chefs and he watches stuff as well. So, when we speak about food, he also brings in the technique and all that. So growing up, I had a lot of exposure to that as well. And then there's my mum, who is, she doesn't have as much technical knowledge as my dad, but she certainly has a lot of experimental creativity, I guess. And in the kitchen, she's always testing things and trialing things based on things she remembers. And often it tastes fantastic. Like my mum's one of those cooks who can just whip something up and it just tastes really good. And I always admired that about her. And now that she's vegetarian, those skills aren't lost. She carries them through in her vegetarian journey as well. And so watching everyone from when I was little until now, even, I learn from everyone. And, I just see how much food is so involved in the family. And then we've also got my brother. So my brother's younger than me by 2-3 years. And he's studied nutrition. So you can see in our family, we've got a lot of food, a love of food in our family. So my brother, even so he studied nutrition, and now he does a lot of recipe testing, and he's at home. Sometimes he's weighing stuff and making sure that the recipes are okay. So yeah, it runs in our family. And my auntie's a fantastic cook as well. So maybe I would say that's probably where all the influence comes from and how it drives into the food content creation, because I've had it since I was little, all around me, really.
That's amazing. I like how it's all kind of where your whole family made it such a big thing for influence wise onto your idea of food and your relationship with it, and how you connect food with family so much. I'm sure a lot of other people, especially diaspora Asian, does, because food is kind of what drives the family to actually come in to hang out for the most part, because normally it's busy. It's only one day of the week where we could all gather around, sit down, and have a nice meal, either dim sum in the morning or there's a big family meal later on at night for that week, and just talk about what's happening that week or something like that. So it's really interesting how you brought up your individual family members made such a big impact on you in terms of food that they wouldn't have probably realized or thought of that it would lead you to what you're doing, food content creating, because I don't think they have that in mind anyways. You're going to be someone that deals with food but not really in the industry per se.
Yeah, and the things that we're talking about, it just struck a memory with me. I have this image in my mind. It's etched forever, really. There was one day when I was typing up or writing up my grandma's recipe, one of them. And then I remember just in front of me, my dad was by the stove and he was seasoning some soup, cooking up something for my mum. And my mum would be next to him by the sink and she'd be washing the vegetables that would eventually end up in the soup. My grandma's right behind me, she's picking or plucking all the herbs off the stems for the garnish. And then just outside the window, you can smell my brother's grilling. He's grilling the lamb or the chicken or whatever it was. And, that scene is actually not uncommon for my family, particularly on the weekends. This time I was writing a recipe or writing my grandma's recipe up, but quite often I'm cooking alongside them. So, in our kitchen, it's quite busy. And these memories are ones that I will never forget. The same way that you were talking about how, sometimes we sit around the table and we have these conversations and they're very warm and fuzzy. But, for me, it's also being part of the kitchen and cooking it before we even get to the dinner table.
That's amazing. It's so warming to hear that, because I think a lot of times we just hear oh yeah, the dad, the mom, and the grandparents are all working somehow and the kids are just off their own regard to do whatever they need to do. I'm sure there's parts of that happening growing up for you to a certain extent as well, because there's busyness all around. But then I was just more curious about how, like, were you always in the kitchen as a kid, like in that way, or like, oh, you're always around that, or it was kind of later on when you're kind of like, oh, I want to get more in tune with like my family in terms of cooking and all that stuff, learning more about the recipes. Like, when did that like really love for like cooking started for you?
That's a good question. I think my love of food was always there, but my love of cooking probably started. I think I was very experimental as a child. So sometimes I had my friends would come over to each other's houses and we'd just experiment. Like, we'd look up recipes online and we'd start experimenting with things, not necessarily Asian food. So I remember we would have made something like a vegetarian lasagna, for example, or we would have baked, some chocolate chip cookies with extra butter or something. But in terms of my love for cooking, that probably didn't start until maybe 10 or so years ago, when I started to learn how to cook from my grandma, when I, deliberately went and followed her around and made it my mission to learn all those recipes. And as I started cooking and learning all the flavors and how they kind of happen in the kitchen, I think that's when it started. And then, getting people to try the food, like my husband and my sister-in-law, they're great taste testers. They love the final taste testing. Seeing their faces light up when they're like, oh, this tastes good. I'm like, yeah, I learned that recipe from my grandma, and just feels so rewarding. And I think the love of cooking really cemented there when I just felt like I had done something that my grandma had done for us. And then I would have done it for my husband and for my sister-in-law and everybody else in the family. So that's a really nice feeling that I can't ever shake off.
So you can definitely, I guess I would say your kind of love language is kind of the food and like making food for others and like enjoying food as well, which I think it's a lot of people's love language as well. Because I think food brings people together and it's always great. And like with you being a food content creator in the sense of like creating recipes and highlighting different foods to your audience and stuff, I was wondering, like, that's really different from just being a home cook, as in like, oh, you're really good at cooking and you make food for your friends and family, but to transition to like making content where it's like you have to take care of like writing, taking pictures, thinking of the processes. Like, how did you learn all those things? Is this trial and error, or you had kind of like some sort of idea before really approaching like this project of like writing and producing content food related? Like, how did that happen?
Well, I think because it started off as, obviously trying to preserve the family's recipes and almost as a hobby, I didn't really have a direction as to where I was going. I didn't know where it would lead. I didn't even know if I would be doing it for a while. And somehow, 2.5 years have passed just like that. So I just, I learn along the way. I look up how to take photos, and I experiment with the camera as well. I look up how to edit photos. I look up how to, write recipes and all that kind of stuff. I research, and that has come along with the journey. I didn't research beforehand. It just happened alongside the content creation. And, sometimes I look back at my early recipes or like the earlier posts and I'll just cringe and I'll be like, oh, I can't believe I wrote it like that, kind of thing. But, it comes along with, I suppose, with every learning journey. You learn along the way. And like you were saying, it's not just the writing, not just like writing the recipes. It comes with learning how to take photos, learning how to write properly, for your audience as well, so that they don't seem like they don't feel like they're reading garbage or something, So just trying to learn everything that I can.
Yeah, so become a very well-rounded content creator and like finding your voice and such. So in terms of your recipe and how you run your content creating, what would you say is your kind of voice or like the style that you have in terms of your recipe? Like, we can get into like how you think of recipes and all that, but like in terms of delivering like recipes or telling the audience how to make certain things, what would you say your style is, or like how do you approach it?
First and foremost, when I write a recipe, I think about someone who would have never made that recipe before. So, I want to make sure that I'm very clear with my instructions, that each step, is accompanied by a picture that, like a process shot that makes sense. And I want to make sure that if they've never made it before, at least with the instructions that I've given them, hopefully they can make something very similar, or that they can make it pretty much identical to what I would have made. And that's my goal, first and foremost. And when it comes to writing about the recipe, that little snippet before the recipe and before the process shots, I like to paint a picture where people might, remember something from their childhood. So maybe they remember, having that with their family, sitting around the table. I'm thinking now of like the spring roll recipe that I wrote recently. I talk about all the aunties sitting around, at the party, rolling the spring rolls and gossiping and so forth. And that's a memory I hope that other people connect with, because maybe they grew up with something similar as well. But I also like to write recipes or describe recipes in a way where they're connecting to it through their senses. So how does it taste? How does it feel? How does it smell? How does the kitchen smell, for example? How does it feel when they come around to it? And hopefully that excites them in a way that makes them want to make the recipe, or put it into their to make list.
I think that's a really good approach, and I really like that. I read a couple of recipes. Like eventually, I'm sure I'm going to try one specifically once I get enough not being lazy and just try it. But it's really clear, really simple to understand, and I think even if you are someone who really afraid of the kitchen, if you follow a recipe from Jeannette, it'll be fine. You'll be okay. So definitely try it out. But you mentioned a lot, you learned a lot of different things, so you can do this kind of recipe sharing, this blog and stuff. So at the end of the day, would you consider yourself like a storyteller, a home cook, or a writer? What would be the biggest thing you would say in terms of this project have you done? What would be the biggest hat you're wearing in terms of it all said and done?
I want to say all of it, but if I had to choose one, probably storytelling, because I feel like through the food and through the recipes themselves, they tell a story on their own. You can taste something and straight away it'll take you back to, something that you would have experienced as a child, for example. Or you can, smell something and then it'll take you back to Christmas, Christmas morning, for example. And I feel like while I would say that I do enjoy being a home cook, I think the recipes themselves lend themselves towards more storytelling if I had to choose one. And obviously the writing part, that would be the storytelling component as well. So I would say storytelling.
Yeah, and you're doing a great job at it. I feel like whenever I read a blog post from you talking about recipe, there's always some background story and very kind of can visualize you and your family doing it, or some sort of you relating your family's history to the food itself, which I think it builds a connection for the audience and makes them really want to try it out, because they want to really experience what you say is really good. And another thing I really appreciate is that you do a lot of different kind of foods. Of course, you do a lot that are close to home, like Chinese or Vietnamese food, but it's such a wide variety. Looking at your website is so many recipes from different categories, got the rice, the soups and meats, and appetizer and all that stuff. So my question is, with all these kind of recipes and whatnot, what are the kind of foods or categories that you really enjoy kind of just making on your own? If you say you don't really have to worry about oh, I need to pick certain things that I know audience will like and such, what would be the things that you would want to constantly make, or you will think of oh, I should try it out?
I've asked myself this question a few times actually. I personally love making noodle soups, particularly Vietnamese noodle soups, because it's one of those dishes where you spend the whole day making, or a good chunk of the day. You've got to start by making the stock, and making sure that it's clear so that it tastes really naturally sweet and so forth. And then you've also got to make the toppings. You've also got to cook the noodles and all that kind of stuff. But it'll take a good chunk of the day, and by the end of it, you'll have a dish that the whole family can enjoy. Not only can they enjoy it, but you can enjoy it for the next few days as well. And noodle soups are one of those things where if you leave it in the fridge for a bit longer, it tastes better the next day. And because I spend a lot of the day making it, I find it so rewarding when it's done. And then when people taste it for the first time, like my husband or my sister-in-law or anyone at home, they taste it and then they say something positive about it. To me, that just completes the whole experience and it makes every second worth it. And I also get to taste this along the way, so that's really exciting too.
That's great. Yeah, I think with noodle soup, like especially Vietnamese noodle soup, it's such a labor of love and takes so long, but it's like so good and rewarding when you get a bowl of like freshly hot bowl of noodle soup. Oh, I just want one right now. But like talking more about like your journey in this thing, like of course, like you said, you just started off like just for yourself, but it's now eventually becoming something where it's like it's a business essentially for you, where it's become where you're getting a lot of like recognition for it. You build a following and such. How do you find that kind of environment? Because you have over 30,000 followers on Instagram, your website, lots of hits and all that stuff, I'm sure. And you're using kind of, I would say, very traditional way of like recipe sharing, which is blog posting and stuff, because a lot of times now people get their like recipes through videos, but it's not something I've seen you really do, which is okay, I'm saying. But like, how do you feel like about like sticking it to just blog posting and also Instagram posts like with the pictures and stuff?
Because I started with a blog post, actually I started with Instagram first, and this was without posting any recipes. I just wanted to share photos. Sorry, the sun's kind of like really bad. I want to just move. But in terms of the blog posts and like the whole business side of things, I find it really exciting because it's something I've never done before, and B, I think it's just really rewarding to see things grow. Like I started from nothing. Like this whole recipe blog thing, it started from nothing, and it started from an interest really. And like I keep saying, I just wanted to make sure my grandma's recipes were preserved. I find it so rewarding moving beyond, just sharing something to something that's really international. And I'm so excited to see where it's going to go next. Because yes, currently I don't have any videos for it, but you just don't know in the future, depending on how things go in terms of time, in terms of, my schedule, who knows. And it's so rewarding to also connect with people who are either like-minded or, have similar experiences. And that's what keeps me coming back. These connections that I make with most often strangers, just over the food content.
Yeah, and honestly, the amount of times or like times that I've seen like, oh, your recipe gets shared in like the circle that I follow and stuff is great, because it's always like, oh yeah, I checked it out. It's really good. It brings me feelings of home and all that stuff, or like make them feel like really happy. So the impact, the power of what you're doing, I could feel it, even though like I'm seeing it from other people reacting to your content. And I could see like you could do it for a very long time because you're doing it because you're passionate about it, and you're not making it like, oh, this is something I'm going to do. This could be my main business, my main career. Like you said, you have your main job, and it seems like you enjoy that job enough that it's not like, oh, I need to get out of it. I need to make my side hustle into my main hustle, that kind of thing, right? Because there are people like that, and that's okay. But for you, it's kind of like, oh, you're just gonna keep doing it because it's fun for you, and you don't have to worry too much like, oh, is it gonna make me money and stuff. Of course, making money is great, but like at the end of the day, you're doing it because you have like a bigger mission, like, oh, want to preserve the recipes of your family and doing what you love, making food and such. And another question I'm really interested to know your thoughts on, like, is how do you find like the whole kind of foodie culture, or like, the whole concept of like, food content becoming so like where people are always like, oh, Yelp reviewers and all that stuff, like that kind of vibes that we get around like, oh, Instagram foodies and all that stuff. And because you are now essentially a part of that system because of how popular your food content is getting, like people will be like, oh, we want your take on food stuff for sure. So like, what do you find about how do you find about it? Like this whole kind of foodie culture these years?
Um, I must say that I'm very much part of that foodie culture, just as a consumer as well. I do love food. My husband and I go on food adventures all the time. But when I started the blog, I wouldn't say I ever intended for it to be part of this foodie culture. When I first started, I suppose the branding that I wanted to have for it was more that, it was a way for people to connect with the taste of home. And that's how I hope the branding is for Wok&Kin. But I think it's just fantastic how this foodie culture brings people together and connects people in a way that other things can't. And, like I keep saying, it brings people together because of the memories, because of all the sentiment that comes with food and all the positive emotions that we all have when we eat food, when we share food. And particularly with Asian culture, I don't know if this applies to all other cultures, but I know with my family, food comes with celebration. They come hand in hand. Lunar New Year, even Christmas, like every celebration that we have, there's a lot of good food involved. Birthdays, for example. And I think, that's why everybody connects, because there are so many great memories that come with food, and it drives this foodie culture. And if I'm part of that foodie culture with, the recipes that I share, then I'm more than happy to be part of it.
Yeah, that's great. And in terms of like all your recipes, what would you say is kind of like the recipe that you really love and enjoy making all the time? Like, is there one that stands out to you more? I assume it would be something that your grandma has like made for you that you really like and you will say it, but you can say that, of course. And I was just wondering, like, what would be your favorite that you also think people should really try out if they want to pick one or two recipes that to start off from your website?
If it's to start off, yeah, probably one of my grandma's recipes. It would be my grandma's, and I've mentioned this in other interviews before, but in my grandma's braised chicken wings with mushrooms and oyster sauce. So she gets the chicken wings and she braises it in oyster sauce with shiitake mushrooms in a way that's very simple. You pretty much just stir fry a few aromatics, chuck everything in along with some liquid, and then you just let it simmer for like 20 plus minutes. And what comes out is just this melt in your mouth chicken wing, and you just have it with rice. And it's so simple to make, and you can't really go wrong with it because it doesn't take a lot of effort to make. So that's something that I would encourage people to start off with if they really wanted to get a taste of Cantonese food, really.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And I think people should definitely try that out. And I'm just thinking for, say, the audience that might not be like good at cooking or like afraid to get into the kitchen, like what advice would you give for those people, like to get at least started? Like I'm sure like you are one of those people that would be able to encourage those to like give it a try after them reading your blogs or like seeing your picture on Instagram. Like what would you say if they ask like, oh, can you give me some starter advice on like how to get into the kitchen and do all the stuff that you're able to do?
I think the best tip that I would have is to start simple. There are millions and millions of recipes out there, and quite often they can be complex. For example, I was talking about noodle soup. It takes about half a day to make, and there are lots of steps, and you have to monitor things at different stages throughout the day. But if you start simple, for example, my grandma's braised chicken wings with oyster sauce, there aren't many steps involved, and that not only means it's easier, it also means that there is less room for error, because you don't really have to monitor a million things happening at the same time. With the noodle soup, it's not like, okay, after 20 minutes, I have to check the soup, make sure that it's not boiling, and then go back to the toppings and go back to cook the noodles. And, oh no, the noodles are boiling now. Got to go and like dump that into the sink and so forth. Something simple like a braised protein or braised tofu even, you can just get the aromatics, get the protein, chuck it all into a pot and just let it simmer. And then that's it. And then you've got something. And the longer you braise it, generally the better the taste. And then you just have some rice with it as well. So that's something quite simple.
That's great. And people definitely should give cooking a try, because I think cooking is such an essential skill to have. And if you're just doing it, like, you don't even have to be that great at it, but then it still yields great results for you. Like, you get a good meal, and that's what anyone can ask for. And with food and like talking about food, I just love asking people like, what's their favorite kind of food? So what are your favorite kind of foods or meal that you really enjoy? It doesn't have to be Asian. It could be just anything that you really enjoy eating and cooking.
I don't know how to cook this, but I absolutely love Lebanese food. I think the smoky flavors of the meat, particularly, and all the sauces, the breads, when they come together, it's like magic in my mouth. It's so good. And I wouldn't mind learning how to make Lebanese food, but at the same time, no matter what I eat and where I eat it, I always crave the taste of home. And for me, that would be like Cantonese food. I know I grew up with a lot of Vietnamese food too, but I think ultimately I cannot walk past Cantonese food, especially like home cooked food where it's like braised or steamed, very simple flavors, but it really highlights the ingredients. That for me is always what I look forward to, no matter where I am or what time of the day.
Yeah, you bring up Cantonese food. So what are your favorite Cantonese foods?
Oh, so many to choose from. Obviously my grandma's one, but another one I love is seafood tofu. It's like silken tofu, and depending on where you go, they make it differently. So I've had some where they get a huge block of tofu, and they lightly fry it on the outside, and then they'll cook like a sauce with it, with like prawns and some veggies like carrots and snow peas, and they'll just pour it on top, and it's like gravy all over the tofu, and you have that with rice. It's amazing. Or some places they cut it into like it comes in a tube. So tofu comes in a tube, and they cut it into little short cylinders, and then that goes into the same method, and it's just amazing. I love that.
Oh, yeah. What would you say is your go-to kind of recommendations for people to give it the first try for Cantonese food?
Ooh.
I guess something that's easy, like kind of hopefully potentially let them try more Cantonese food that's way more elevated or something like that. Like what would be like a starter?
Maybe I would say something steamed, like, when we go and have dim sum, yum cha, when you have like the steamed pork with the black bean sauce. Just something simple where you can just put the sauces together, mix it all in, and then just steam it. So you can still really taste the pork, but it's just highlighted by the black bean sauce, or the black beans and the simple ingredients that are in there as well. Just something simple like that would be a good start, because the flavors are not too intense, and they're not too contrasting either. So it's something easy to start with.
That's great. And you talking about like, oh yeah, Cantonese food, you grew up eating it, and of course your family would be able to make it themselves. But I want to know, like, because you mentioned, oh yeah, you're from Australia, and a lot of times when people do talk about Asian food and stuff, I think a lot of the focus has always been like North America, or like kind of like in Europe. But like Australia, they will say, oh yeah, there are lots of Asian, but they don't really talk about like the Asian food specifically. Can you just talk a little bit about how the Asian food is in Australia and all that stuff? Because I personally have never been to Australia.
Yeah, you're more than welcome to come and visit. In Australia, I can't speak for the whole of Australia because I haven't traveled like all over Australia. But just where I live, we have a lot of, I suppose, like niche suburbs. So there are a lot of there's like a Vietnamese suburb where there are lots of Vietnamese people and Vietnamese food. And it's heavily concentrated. So the flavors that you get are very authentic as well. And then there are suburbs where there are lots of Chinese people. So quite a few suburbs actually. And you might just have to travel like a little bit further. But yeah, lots of different suburbs where there are clusters of a particular Asian, I suppose, and the food is generally really good there because I've only traveled to Hong Kong, and like when I compare the food from Hong Kong to the Cantonese food that I have here in Sydney, I find that they're fairly close. I can't speak as a native Hong Kong person, but I find the flavors quite similar, and I think we're quite lucky in that sense. So yeah, I would say the food here is actually really good. Asian food anyway.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that. And if I ever
Chinese and Vietnamese too.
if I ever make it to Australia, I definitely want to try it out. Even though I would also like to try like kangaroo meat and all that stuff. Because I heard good things about that too. And I mean,
you'll be surprised that we don't actually eat it that much. Beef and pork and stuff is still very common, but yeah, we do have that available.
And I heard like it's one of those things where it's sustainable to keep eating kangaroo meat just because in Australia at least they are considered like not really that endangered or anything like that to anyhow, like, right? So
I've heard that too.
But it's interesting how like people describe kangaroo meat. Like, how would you describe kangaroo meat for those that haven't tried?
Oh, I haven't. The last time I had it was probably like 10, 20 years ago. Actually, no, not 20, like 15 years ago. So, from memory, it was like beef, but not as strong. Yeah, that's what I remember, but I could be very wrong.
So you're saying it's not really something that you really care for, or else you would be eating it more regularly?
I think if it was readily available the way that other proteins are, I probably wouldn't mind. But because it's not easy to come by, like in the local markets for us anyway, we don't really have that like out for sale. I think you have to go somewhere pretty special to actually get it.
So it's one of those kind of more like it's either tourist kind of heavy kind of location that, you know, if we want a niche or like specialty kind of Australian food, you can find it, or else under normal circumstances you wouldn't be eating it like it's a regular meal. Wow. I didn't expect that.
Yeah. No, when did I have it? I had it when my friends and we went to this food expo, and they had all these different samples around, and one of them happens to be kangaroo meat served on a cracker. And yeah, so that's how we tried it for the first time. But other than that, I don't think I've ever had kangaroo meat.
Oh, that's very interesting. Like I always assume that, oh yeah, Australians eat kangaroo like it's any other protein like chicken and beef and all that stuff. Wow, I'm actually kind of very surprised by that, because I've been like always been told like you gotta try kangaroo meat when you go to Australia, which I'm sure I should. But at the same time, I thought people would say that just because Australians tell them to do it, like because they eat it a lot themselves, that kind of thing.
We don't. Well, I can't speak for every Australian, but I certainly don't.
That's interesting. Like I think for the most part we've been talking a lot about your content and what you do, and it's really interesting. And we kind of glossed over like your upbringing and all that stuff. So towards the end now, it's been a great talk, but I just kind of want to know more about like how was it like growing up in Australia for you? Like, because I haven't had that many guests that I interviewed that grew up in Australia. So I would like to hear your kind of perspective on growing up in Australia and how you felt about it.
I don't have any other experiences to compare to, so for me, I'd say it's pretty normal. But when I grew up, I think I mentioned earlier that I grew up with a lot of children very much like me, where parents might have been from overseas, maybe fleeing from war, just looking for a better life. And because of that, in the areas that I lived in, a lot of the schools really catered for that, and they really respected that as well. So quite often in schools, the teachers would recognize that, and a lot of the activities, a lot of the learning was around, making sure that they appreciated and respected our home language or our mother tongue. And then, English was an additional language or an additional dialect for some as well. In my schooling life, usual, go to school, come home, And then, grandma would make us lunch and so forth. But yeah, I think my experience as a child was probably no different to other people in other parts of the world. I'm not sure. Is it similar with you?
I would say I would, because I was a child that grew up in Canada, and I would say Canada is known for like multiculturalism, in a sense where they try to respect people's cultures and be inclusive and such. But I never really hear Australia or how it is like in Australia. So it's nice to hear your perspective on like your upbringing. I didn't, because I just assumed like Australia would be similar in vein, but at the same time could probably be like America, where it's like a melting pot, like they just say, like everything melts into one kind of collective culture, which I think people who are familiar with America can agree to a certain extent that that's what they intend to do, and that's kind of the policy, regardless of whether you think it's right or wrong. It's just how they do it. But with Australia, I don't think we hear too much on like how it is in terms of multiculturalism and all that stuff. I think a lot of people are just generally just talk about the beaches, it's summer all the time, and like kangaroo meat, and like and the fact like the wages are really high and all that stuff. So
there are elements of those as well, but I would say very much like how you had with your Canadian upbringing. We try to have multiculturalism. We celebrate multiculturalism as well, and I make sure that I try to, in my classroom, I try to make sure that I welcome all the different cultures as well, and make sure that as a teacher, everybody's kind of respected in that sense, and we celebrate all the cultures that we have in our class as well. And I'm sure that growing up, that was my experience, because I don't remember any negative memories of those.
That's great. And you mentioned again, like you're a teacher. So which grade do you teach, or are you kind of like, you teach all kids, that kind of thing? Or
I have taught all ages. So in Australia, we have kindergarten to year 6, which is kindergarten would be 4s turning 5-year-olds, and then or like 5-year-olds, and then year 6 is like maybe like 12-ish, 12, 13. Yeah, so I've taught every age group within that. But this year I've got years 3 and 4, which would be 10, 11-ish, those kids. And then before that, for the previous years that I was teaching, I had infants, so like all the little ones. So I've taught that. I haven't gone to upper primary yet, but that's probably where I'm headed to eventually.
so there's a natural kind of progression, like you gain more experience and then you move further up the ages. Is that how it works?
Not necessarily. It just depends on the school. Some schools, you fit on a grade for like 10 years or something, but with our school, we like to challenge ourselves. So every 2 years or so, we'll kind of change. Unless you've got experience with all the grades, then you can pretty much go anywhere. But because this is my 7th year, I believe, 7th year teaching, so I don't have the experience of every single grade just yet.
That's really cool. And are there any specific subjects that you generally teach, or are you kind of like a general kind of teacher that teaches them all?
I'm a general. I teach everything. Yeah.
Oh,
and
wow.
I do work cooking into my lessons as well. So my kids love the cooking days.
Do you have cooking classes, or like at least demonstrate? Oh, that's really cool.
So when I was with infants, with the little ones, we could afford to do it once a week, because there were fewer kids and it wasn't as expensive. But with the older kids, there are more kids, so it's a little bit more costly, and also there's a lot more content that we have to teach. So I told them that, we do it every fortnight, and they always get excited about it. And they ask me, what's the next recipe, or what are we cooking this week? And I was like, what do you guys want to make? So I try to work in the love of food and cooking with my kids, and some of them get really excited about it.
That's great. And what are like the recipes that they really enjoy, like that you bring up, that, whenever you say we're making this, it's like, oh yes, I can't wait for that.
Yeah, and they always suggest things, and sometimes they talk about their families and things that they eat at home. And I say, oh, you should invite your parents to come in and teach us how to make, for example, this dish that they use for celebrations during Ramadan, for example. And I was like, oh, I'd love to learn how to make that as well. Yeah, so it's a great community kind of exercise, I guess.
Is the cooking aspect something that's part of like the like general Australian school curriculum, or is something that you just like brought in like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
I can do this. You think it's great for the kids, and like your school's just like, yeah, we should go do it, or it's really just or not mandated, but like it's part of like the Australia curriculum. It's like we should involve cooking somehow.
Yeah, so it's not in the curriculum. It's not mandated at all, but I like cooking. So, every teacher has their own little, it's not expertise, but, their own interest. The teacher downstairs, she's very good with woodwork and stuff. So she always works woodwork into her lessons as well, which is something I cannot do. But, I love to cook. So that's what I do with my kids. And if I have, an extra bit of time, then I'll always try and work something in so that they get to experience something outside of, the usual subjects that we do, because they're skills that they can use in the future as well. And it's also great when they cook, even the kids who don't like food, the kids who are really picky, it's like a science experiment. When I, mix the ingredients together, I pass the bowl around and they smell it, they hear it, they watch it happen, and it's like magic for them, and they see all the changes, like a science experiment, So, even kids who don't like food, they appreciate that part of it, the science part of it, where things change. And so it's really fun to see.
A really cool thing happening in your classes. Their kids are lucky. I really enjoyed our conversation thus far, and it's been a great time. And it's towards the end of this conversation, but before we go, I would just like to do like a quick kind of like ask you a question, and you just give me like the first kind of answer you can think of, and just let us know what your thoughts and feelings about a certain topic are. It's pretty simple, nothing too serious. Are you ready for it?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Let's start with an easy one. Favorite dim sum.
Hakao.
Oh yeah, good choice.
Yeah.
How about your pineapple on pizza? Yes or no?
Oh, no. Oh, okay. Yes, I can eat it, but I know a lot of people don't.
Oh, so yes for you.
Yes.
You're okay with it.
Yeah, but I know a lot of people will hate me for that.
And favorite noodle dish, or noodle dish, I guess.
Oh, there's this Vietnamese one called bung mắm, which is like a fermented shrimp paste thing. And I'm only saying it because it's the first thing that popped up in my mind, because it's the first noodle recipe, like noodle soup recipe I learned, because it's my husband's favorite dish. Yeah, so I really like that too.
And your favorite thing that your mom makes?
Oh, every weekend, before she became a vegetarian, on Saturdays, she would make this noodle soup dish called Wok&Kin, and it's like a tapioca noodle with chicken. Normally it's served with pork, but she'd make it with chicken, and just very simple, humble food. And I used to love eating that all the time. I miss it so much.
And you said that your dad's not really a chef like that, but what's your favorite food that he would make when he does make food?
Oh, that tofu dish that I was telling you about. He's made it before. It's really good.
So he likes cooking, but at the same time, it's not a thing for him, is it?
He only cooks if he has to. So yeah, he doesn't cook often.
Okay. But you still can learn a lot from him, because you said like he knows around the kitchen and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And favorite kind of city in Australia?
Sydney. That's where I am from.
That's a very safe answer for sure. And what would you say is the hardest kind of dish or food that you find that you like? Oh, it's really hard for me to make. Like it annoys you when you have to make it.
Oh, this is pretty easy. But any baking dish that requires flour, I am not a baker really. I do have some recipes that involve flour online, but before that goes live, quite often I will have tested and failed like 5 times before I get it just right. So I'm definitely not a baker. Any kind of baking recipe, yeah.
Oh yeah, baking is a tough one. There's like so many variables can go a
Mm,
little bit off, and it just ruins the whole product. So
uh-huh,
yeah. And
100%.
what would you say, rice or noodle?
Oh man, you're giving all the hard questions. Rice.
Oh, why?
Yeah,
Whoa. Is there a particular reason?
yeah. I think because with rice you can have lots of side dishes and just kind of like mix it up. Whereas with noodles, often it's just the one thing, and then after you've eaten it, you're just too full to eat something else. Whereas with rice, you can just really change the variety around. So that's probably why.
True. Yeah. How about this, hot pot or Korean barbecue?
Oh, hot pot for sure.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my husband and I eat hot pot a lot. Actually, I think he wants to eat it this weekend.
It's so easy to just get it started, and like it's so delicious, easy, so
Yeah.
easily perfect. Well, there's always
Mm,
the Thai kind where it's barbecue and hot pot at the same time, which I
yeah.
really think is really good too. And what would you say it's something you don't like eating?
Oh, um, I don't. I'm actually quite a picky eater, surprisingly. I don't like coriander,
Mm.
and I don't know what people call it in other places around the world. I think it's so we call it coriander, but in Australia, but I think in other parts of the world it's cilantro.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I also don't like celery.
Oh,
Yeah,
is it the
so
texture or what? What is it specifically?
probably not the texture. I'm quite open to texture. I think it's the flavor.
Mm.
I can't do the flavor. Yeah.
It's interesting you say flavor because when I think of celery, I don't think there's any flavor in it. Just because you often think, oh,
Yeah.
if you slice up some celery, you often put like ranch with it or like peanut butter and or that stuff.
Yeah. I hear about that. Yeah, I don't do that. But yeah, because like my family, they all eat like they eat cilantro and celery, and they don't mind it at all. And they have the same reasoning as you as well. They're like, it doesn't taste like anything. Or with cilantro, it's just so fragrant. And I'm like, I don't know, there's something. It doesn't taste quite right in my mouth. But if the recipe calls for it, I will put it in there. But I personally won't eat it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you're a picky eater to a certain extent.
Mhm. Yeah.
And well, oh, I mean, cilantro is. I feel like it's. I could live without it. It's not a big deal. Same as celery.
Oh
Those two are like it's kind of a whatever kind of. I don't think it really enhances the overall meal or the food that you're
yeah.
making. I don't see how like oh people can say oh I really like cilantro that kind of thing. I think it's just it's there whatever, but
Mm.
or I would say it's like it's overrated. You don't need cilantro. But another question here is uh favorite kind of drink of choice.
Oh. Um. I would. Oh, this is going to be a boring answer, but water. Usually, when I go out to have meals, I almost always just have water. I know, and my husband always gets like a Coke, and sometimes my friends will get like an iced tea or something. But I generally just drink water. But only with my meals. When I'm like just around, I don't drink enough water. But yeah, I think if I had to choose one beverage, it would be water, or maybe like a milkshake or something, like a thick
Mm.
shake. Although
And I
I
guess
wouldn't have that with a meal.
And I guess the last question to end up this conversation would be the restaurant, the Australian restaurant you will recommend people to try if they ever visit Australia.
Oh, this is a tough one. Uh-huh. Okay. Depending on cuisine, let's say you're after Vietnamese cuisine, there is a restaurant in a suburb called Cabramatta and Cabramatta is like a lot. There are lots of Vietnamese people there, and those restaurants are quite authentic. There is a restaurant called, I'm probably going to butcher the name, but it's called Sung Lai, and it's spelled Tuong space Lai, and they have everything that they make there is really good and really fresh as well.
What about like an Australian restaurant?
Oh, like if you want a steak or something.
Mm. I
Oh,
assume you want to say Outback Steakhouse, that kind of.
maybe I will. No. I wouldn't. I don't. I can't say I eat many like Australian like restaurants at Australian restaurants. I eat a lot of Asian restaurants. So unfortunately I don't have a recommendation. Like nothing that has ever blown me away before.
Mm. So you're saying like the Asian food is top notch in Australia, so you can just go try out Asian food in
Pretty
Australia.
much, yeah. Unless I'm just very biased, which is possible as well.
But it's all good. Just try out food in Australia. You'll find something you like, I'm sure. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and really appreciate having you on, sharing your story, and learning more about you and your content. And for those that are interested in knowing more about you, your story, and your content, where can they find you?
If you want some recipes, you can go on to www.wok&Kin.com. Or if you're just after, looking at some pictures of food, you can just go on my Instagram, which is at Wok&Kin.
Yeah, her pictures are really nice. Every time I look at it, it's like, oh, I want that, or I want to eat. And it's like, it's always so nicely presented. Like the styling is top notch. So definitely either check out the website for the recipe or just Instagram, just look for food so that, sometimes you get hungry, you just want to look at it, but you don't want to eat because it's too late in the night. I guess it's either a torture or it really helps you to like push you through to like the morning when you can eat again. But regardless, thank you so much for this talk. Thank you for your time, and all the best to you in all that you do. And for all the listeners, thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to keep supporting this podcast, make sure to follow this podcast on all streaming platforms that you listen to your podcast on, and also follow the Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. And till next time, bye bye.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye.